Over the past few weeks, the U.S.-led coalition in Syria has been increasing airstrikes, particularly around Raqqa. While the goal is to retake the area from ISIS, United Nations officials estimate the bombings have killed hundreds of civilians since March and forced about 160,000 more to flee. This is just the latest battle in the 5-year war raging in Syria, where President Bashar al-Assad has violently crushed his opponents. Rebel groups have arisen, and ISIS has gained strength in all the chaos. That's the subject of a new documentary on National Geographic called Hell on Earth, The Fall of Syria and the Rise of ISIS. Some of the footage in this segment is hard to watch, much of it showing killings and the victims, including kids. At the same time it chronicles the physical violence, it also zeroes in on the psychological terror. Here's a clip.
اشبك بابا اشبك بابا لا تخافي لا تخافي ما في شيء بابا بدي اضحك غصبا عني عشان هالاطفال هي ما تخاف او تتلبك صراحه بدي انفجر.
Joining me is Academy Award-nominated filmmaker and best-selling author Sebastian Junger, who collaborated with Nicholas Quested. Did I get his name right?
Quested, yeah.
Sebastian, it's great to see you again.
Thank you.
The movie is really hard to watch, as you know, really graphic, both physically and emotionally. I'm sure shot and reported at great risk. What did you set out to do? What was the goal at the beginning of the project?
We wanted to explain the Syrian Civil War. I mean, why it got started, why so many people have died, what made it different from the other Arab Spring countries, and particularly why it led to the rise of ISIS. I mean, ISIS is this sort of international pariah. They're renowned for their bloodthirsty behavior, and we wanted to explain that they're a kind of logical outcome from a certain circumstance.
Well, explain that logical outcome from these are peaceful protests by people who are upset with Assad, and then what happens?
Well, you've got two things going on. First of all, there were peaceful protests, like in all of the Arab Spring countries. Mm-hmm. People demanding their sort of democratic reforms, like any reasonable person would want. That was met with gunfire. Eventually, if you kill civilians enough, they will arm themselves and fight back. That's what happened. That's how demonstrations turned into a civil war. The longer civil wars go on, the more they sort of favor radical elements, partly, frankly, because they're willing to die for a cause, and the more radical you are, the more willing you are to die. That gives them an advantage on the battlefield. So the population was getting radicalized, but in addition, there was this weird vector from Iraq. The Sunni population in Iraq had been really marginalized by the Shia-backed government, our government, basically. And first Al-Qaeda and then ISIS moved in to protect them from the Shia.
You know, the physical violence that you show, and I don't know if that's been controversial since it's been released. It's really graphic. I think it's really necessary. Obviously, you and your colleague did too. But I have to say, that didn't do it to me as much as the emotional violence in this movie. Both, I think the Radwan was the guy there. Here's a little clip with his brother, Marwan. Is that not his name? Here is Marwan and his family. Just watch.
خططوا لما اجوا وشاف العيله خاف ابو الكاميون قال مستحيل اصلا اهربكم لما وصلت سيارة عند الحاجز انا يعني بحاله رعب هي مرتي صارت ترجف صرت اقرا ايات قرانيه ادعي هالمسافه هي اكلت معنا شيء يمكن ربع ساعه الربع ساعه انا متت فيها 100,000 موته.
Are Marwan, who we just saw, and Radwan, who we saw at the beginning, they're not atypical at all, are they?
No, I don't think so. I think they're just good, ordinary people who are trying to survive in the civil war. That's the vast majority of civilians in any civil war. And they managed to escape to Turkey. You
know, last time you were here, you were with Andrew Basovich and Seth Moulton. We were talking about PTSD and veterans and that sort of stuff. I know you just spent a huge amount of your life working on that kind of stuff. How do these people not all have PTSD? I mean, how do they live?
Listen, I mean, they're deeply traumatized. I remember when I was in Sarajevo, that was my first war, there were children that had shocks of white hair from trauma, you know, young children. But humans are adaptive. We are wired to overcome trauma. I mean, if that weren't true, the human race wouldn't exist. We wouldn't have survived. So they're survivors. They're going to make it.
How much of blame does the United States have here? You show the video that we've all practically memorized. I think it's from August of 2012, thereabouts, when Barack Obama makes the now infamous red line speech, and we know what happened with that. How much of the blame for the chaos and dislocation and death does the United States hold?
I think very little, actually. I mean, there were 4 or 5 Arab Spring countries. Syria was one of them. We didn't start that, and we weren't really in a position to stop it either. Once the Civil War got going, so there was a dynamic in these countries in 2011 that had its own logic, its own momentum. It wasn't a creation of ours. But once the war got started, you could argue that the Western powers, not just the U.S., had a moral obligation to try to stop it.
But we had a coalition. When you say we're not to blame, I mean, from my recollection from your film as well, is there was really a coalition of the willing, ready to go with Barack Obama until they found out that the rug was pulled out from under them.
Well, that's the 2 levels of responsibility. It's not our fault that it started.
Oh, I understand.
But there was a time when we might have been able to stop it. I'm not sure the airstrikes he had in mind were designed to stop the war so much as to be punitive as a reaction to the use of chemical weapons. So I don't know what he had in mind. Certainly the kind of NATO bombardment of Bosnia that I saw that resulted in the end of the war, that might have stopped the Syrian Civil War, but I don't know what the coalition had in mind.
And 59 Tomahawk missiles on an airfield a month or so ago does nothing.
It does nothing except that there is some value in symbolism, and there is some value in communicating, look, you did this, we did that. If you do that, we may do that. And so the problem with doing nothing, which is what Obama did, and by the way, I voted for Obama. I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I had no problem saying that publicly. But the problem with what Obama did is basically he communicated, look, you can do something outrageous and we're not going to act. And that sends a signal, oh, why don't you try upping your game? Right.
You know, I started this by talking about the progress we're making in Raqqa, this sort of last stronghold there. But it seems to me, as someone who is not expert in this area as you are, is the good news is we're making progress. The bad news is the primary beneficiary of the progress is Assad. I mean, if we're essentially wiping out his chief enemy, his chief powerful enemy, are we not?
This is the irony. He wants ISIS there because no Western power is going to back ISIS as a legitimate regime, right? The biggest threat to Assad actually were the moderate factions that start in the beginning that were wanting real democracy. That was the threat to Assad because he knew that they would be appealing to Western powers.
And they were the ones we didn't want to arm because we weren't sure if we could trust them or not trust them.
Exactly.
You know, you say this is once involved in a proxy fight, meaning when so many countries have a stake in this thing, it's almost impossible to stop. So how does it stop?
Well, first of all, I think ISIS is an evil and violent movement that needs to be crushed. I mean, the world can't. We can't afford to have ISIS just sort of laying around, right? So, and they are getting rolled up, and I think that's a good thing. Assad's not going anywhere. He's just as evil as ISIS, of course. He's a little more efficient than they are. He's not going anywhere. He's got Iran behind him. He's got Russia behind him. He's not going to be toppled. So what that means is the end of the war, like in Bosnia, might come through a kind of partitioning of the country, which in some ways seems too bad, and in other ways, if it ends the bloodshed, that's the right thing to do. And I think that's ultimately what might happen.
Why are you so drawn to war? I'm really thrilled, and I think the world should be thrilled that you are. But in 30 seconds, why are you drawn? I mean, this is not the first people know of your films on this kind of subject matter.
War, you know, it's an incredibly serious, important topic. It shapes world events. The stakes are enormously high. And as something that I've experienced personally, it feels like the most meaningful job you could ever have is trying to understand and communicate it. I've stopped war reporting, by the way. A few years ago, I stopped after Tim Hetherington, my colleague, got killed. But I think it's an incredibly important job.
Well, you do it beautifully, I should say.
Thank you.
Really powerfully. Sebastian, it's great to see you.
Very
Sebastian Junger. Again, you can see Hell on Earth, The Fall of Syria and the Rise of ISIS on the National Geographic Channel. It's on demand now.